What we live in is a set of systems that overlap and interact, on which I would say are never truly stable, but are always at a tipping point. Actually, it's just a pause between periods of huge disruption, whether that be world wars in the early 20th century, pandemics in the early 20th century, global depressions in the early 20th century, fear of Armageddon in the middle of it, through to the climate change burning the planet, and a global depression 10 years ago, and now another pandemic. So the context is always disruptive. No single organism, no single organisation can prepare for all of the potential disruptions it's going to face. It can only prepare for not only the things that it thinks it can predict, but those things that are within its capability of adjusting. What we're missing is the way, again, in which our social systems and all of the other systems around us, legal, economic and so on, interact with that organism. We're still focusing in on a level of detail that isn't really helpful to us. And what we're also missing is the way in which our own psychology interacts with that set of systems. So unless you know when something is going to happen, or that it's going to happen to you, we as human beings and as organisations do not invest time and energy and intellect into preparing for those moments. Individual human beings, CEOs, have an agenda. They have a limited time span in which to implement that. They're not typically in the job for more than 2 or 3 or 4 years these days. And therefore the psychological mindset of leaders is not necessarily to think of the vast array of things that could disrupt their business. And then beyond that, not because you have a market and investors trying to drive return on investment out of a business element. If you're working at the scale of the organisation, it's about reimagining what that organisation does. It's not a bunch of stuff that you deploy to do something. In a way, the organisation is whatever you can bring to meet the need of that customer or that student, whatever you can bring, whether I own it, you own it, she owns it down the road, whether we rent it, whether we borrow it, whether we steal it, the organisation is vastly permeable, or should be. An ecosystem within which you can attract and bring lots of different types of organisational DNA, so that if something hits and I'm not prepared for it, then Bernadette might be prepared for it, or Zinzi might be prepared for it, or Eli might be prepared for it. And that gives you the opportunity to bring in from external sources the stuff that you just can't have on a shelf somewhere because you can't afford it, you haven't got time for it. So the network is your friend, and that is the only way that you're ever going to get agility at the scale of the organisation. There's an inner way of looking at it that says, who have I got in my organisation? Who is the weirdo? Who is the person who sees things differently? Who is the person that no one really gets on very well with? And how can I embrace that difference and recognise that it makes my DNA richer, my organisational DNA, and also gives me more chance of connecting with more different people outside of my organisation. So it's kind of big picture. You can't really make your whole organisation agile. And what do you do about that? You build your ecosystem, you nurture your petri dish, and then within the petri dish and within the ecosystem, it becomes about the cultural underpinnings of curiosity, of listening, of collaboration, of being prepared to think the unthinkable, being prepared to listen to people you haven't got patience for.
We seem to have lost most of our tolerance for uncertainty. And what I'm seeing in many organizations as well is we tend to project this onto our leaders, onto anybody who's involved in change management. We're essentially asking people or expecting people to be certainty merchants for us. We need to recultivate our relationship with uncertainty There are these narratives that we've all bought into, that clarity, stability, predictability, those things are normal. And ambiguity, volatility, and uncertainty is not normal. And we're willing to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty for a while, but then we expect things to go back to what we consider to be normal. We're basically seeing an entangling now of really big, I think some people will call them wicked problems, but they're not even really problems. They're just dynamics playing out around the world. And many of the leaders that I work with feel a bit unmoored. It's as if we've collectively lost our moorings. What has made us successful up to now, the very nicely linearly packaged frameworks and the things that we're taught in business schools, and everything that we've kind of built our sense making around is failing us. People don't even know what the right questions are that they should be asking, that we're always in different contexts, and that there is no one size fits all, and there are no silver bullets, and we need to start becoming more contextually intelligent so that we know what kind of a context are we in, and therefore how do we need to act. You can have very complicated folds, but the key thing here is that I can unfold it, fully understand it, and then refold it or even replicate the fold. So this is a kind of a system. It's a closed system. It's a system that I can fully understand. There's linear cause and effect relationships. It's predictable. So this is the domain of expertise. Complex systems are different. So plex means woven together, but I prefer the idea of entanglement. And I think we've seen so many examples now with COVID-19. Because, in the past, I felt a little bit like Chicken Little, telling everybody that you live in a complex world and it's inherently uncertain and you can't predict. And I think now everyone can see it. Many of the innovations, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry came from accidents, from unintended consequences. But then also, it introduces a lot of risk. So we really need to understand that when we are in complexity, and complex, whenever there are human beings involved, typically we're in complexity. And the more interconnected we become, the more complex the world becomes. But complexity calls for us to do some very counterintuitive things. And I really enjoyed what Martin was saying is, people, when we are not in a crisis, we tend to, if something is not salient to us, so it's not right in front of us, we tend to want to ignore it. And I think one of the key shifts, and very often people get a bit of an allergic reaction, but one of the key shifts is from efficiency to resilience. And resilience essentially requires us, for example, to have redundancy in our systems, to have some slack. And what we've seen is that efficiency has essentially removed all the redundancy from our systems, and therefore our systems have become brittle. And we have, things like culture, for example. In so many of my clients, we have, these drives to creating a singular culture. Not that I think that we can ever do that, but if we could get to that, it would completely strip that system of its resilience. We want people to be aligned to goals, aligned to values, and it's become a euphemism for agreement. So we want coherence, we want things to make sense, but we don't necessarily want everybody to be aligned towards a particular goal or to be in agreement, because then again, we've lost some of our diversity. We love recipes, and we just love, to be able to just take something, give me the answers, give me the 5 steps. Think that we can design ideal cultures and engineer them. Versus scaffolding emergence, and this may sound a bit jargony, but a scaffold is a temporary structure that enables other things to grow around it. So how do we create the conditions where the culture that we want can emerge versus trying to engineer it? We all already know how to handle complexity. If you've ever driven on the road, if you've ever gone to a party, if any social interaction, if you've used public transport, you've navigated a complex system. We just choose to think that we are in a wonderfully ordered world whenever we step across the threshold into our workplaces. To build resilience and to be in complexity, is to unlearn a lot of things that we've been taught as best practices.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to unlearn something. It's
I think that's much harder because it becomes so ingrained in you, and when you start looking at your brain patterning and all of that kind of stuff and how things become hardwired, you stop questioning.
Culture as providing the support for strategy during implementation. Often involves tough decisions, depends on the operation, and if culture and strategy are not aligned, and you can expect some pushback from the organization. And in the meanwhile, external industry market conditions are changing. It has a lot to do with topics that Mark and Sonia were bringing to the conversation, because those external influences are going to be pounding on the organization. Basically, changing external conditions can affect your strategy by destabilizing to your organizational values, create a stability in the organization. They create justifying influence for your employees. So it helps your employees to see why they're doing what they've been asked to do. And it provides a framework for decisions that are taken under these destabilizing influences. Essentially, without some form of stabilization through cultures or values, you can end up going places where you intend to go. Now, generally, strategies don't fail in this moment. More commonly, we see small failures occurring at operational levels throughout the organization. We take away the things that weren't on weren't on the list of things that we felt we needed to support our strategy. This is what we end up with. If we overlay on that values that were espoused by senior management, then you can see there's quite a lot of commonality. On the other hand, if we overlay the values that were important to employees, then the only one that really is common is safe, common to free. What do we learn from this? First of all, senior managers formulate a strategy that is consistent with their own values. And the values embedded in the company's culture, in this case, were not considered and just happened to be very different. So, yes, we expect that trouble will ensue. And the strategy is aligned with the organization follows naturally. I'd like to just pause here for a moment and point out that, although we talk about culture and strategy being in alignment, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are trying to impose a formula or formulaic approach. Rather, we need to have values that provide guideposts that are used to as ways for people to determine whether decisions are being taken the right way or the wrong way, but they give the freedom at the same time to allow people to express their individuality, such as this person who was doing something that was in alignment with the value that was desired, but was doing it his own way, and came up with an innovative solution that no one else was doing.
What they should have done right at the outset was consider the values that were existing in the organisation as a potential constraint on the options they were considering as a strategy.
Management assumes that everybody gets it, that they put the strategy out there and everybody's going to understand what they're trying to achieve. That isn't always the case. But if you can break it down and identify what those strategy deliverables are, that helps you to understand what values need to be in place to ensure that you can deliver on those outcomes. Determine what values are actually driving the organization's culture. This is where management really failed. They didn't consider that the organization had values that were different to theirs. It was to take action to close the gaps or adapt the strategy on the culture. Naturally, culture is the easiest thing in the world to change, and it can take time. So start by conducting a values discovery audit to uncover the organization's values. I'd suggest using some form of values framework. Benefits that come out of that is that it speeds up the process because everyone is using a common language. The results are consistent with people, so it's good for tracking over time because you want to determine if your values are staying in the culture staying consistent, or are you moving culture? And it allows comparison against benchmarks.
If you're not careful to figure out who the person is that's going to undermine this effort, you're actually going to lose out. So that's my opinion about values. You can't force values.
It's an issue around how to communicate. It's to contextualize. Sonia mentioned something about context, and I think it's to contextualize the values for each and every audience according to their reasons for being. My role is actually important. I think it's the onboarding, the induction, and the definition of your role. I think we fail in the leadership to better articulate each role. When you come in, we just tell the cleaning company that's contracted, make sure that I have 5 ladies in the canteen. You know, the 5 ladies don't even know who commissioned them. They have no mandate from the president of the school. They don't even know there's a principal. They've never even seen the man.
The unsung heroes in the organization are often the ones at the front line who are performing very important functions and are in fact conveying the image of the organization to the customer.
I wonder if there's 2 levels of values. The one is the level of the organization's value and how it values and how it intends to serve its market, and the other is the internal values. You know, that point for me was really driven home in a small little business, 12, 15 people in the company, and if the lady who cleaned the toilets came to work, it was a crisis for everyone. And you don't put that stuff in your value statement in terms of how you intend to conduct business, but that it is very evident of how particularly leadership, and they always say the fish rots from the head, how leadership does or doesn't value the internal dynamics of the organization.
By focusing on the customer who ultimately brings the money into the organization, who is able to then sustain the organization, then and getting everybody in the organization to follow those values, then obviously you are almost pointing everyone in the same direction.
However much, you know, a leader might try and say to people working in the chicken factories that Doug was talking about, you know, the X is really important. The X is the customer, the X puts food on your table. People will respond to that if they can't put food on their table any other ways. But if unless you're saying you're actually going to take food off their table, if they don't comply with that command, you know, you're likely to get very uncompliant behaviour. I would think. Kind of, we used to say the customer is king, and I agree with that to a point. But I think one of the interesting generational shifts in demographic systems that we've been talking about, systems on the social shift, is people are so much more now looking for meaning in their work, so much more now looking for their work to be purposeful for them personally, that although it's a good call to arms, if you like, it's not a banner that everybody is going to rally around.
It's very important that communication be 2 ways. It's not only from management down to the organization. That there is a demographic shift, that people are much more concerned now with getting satisfaction and meaning out of the work that they do.
Today we talk about customer experience and employee experience in virtually the same breath.
Some of the companies that I work in that's got the most wonderful values are also the most dehumanized organizations that I've come across. And I think values, and I can't make a blanket statement, but in many organizations, I think they're just platitudes on a wall.
Real values are hidden. This is what management wants people to believe.
Versus positioning boundaries almost, or positioning values almost as boundaries. You know, humans need to understand where the boundaries are. There are some words, I think, that's almost lost their meaning because of how we've misused them.
Yes, it is possible to direct culture, obviously, and culture develops by itself because of the actions and beliefs. But the view that, as you say, Sonia, I'm going to define my values because this fits in with my strategy, and you will all abide by this. But what we actually see in the organization, through multitude of observations that are actually pretty simple to make, tells you a total different story. How on earth do you expect people to buy into that when you don't buy into it yourself as a leader?